world. Hello and welcome to the very first Listen Over Lunch with the incredible Jim Rossi, my good friend, who is coming up on 300,000 LinkedIn followers. And incredible the work he's doing. A graduate student from UC Berkeley, and my name is Kellen Kautzman. I'm a serial entrepreneur, and we are going to take you on a journey through free speech at UC Berkeley. We're going to take a look at Nicholas Taleb's Antifragile, a fantastic book that we've both read and enjoyed. And last but not least, we are going to be discussing artificial intelligence as it relates to video marketing in your business in 2018. So let's start with UC Berkeley. Jim, first of all, glad to be here.
Likewise.
And is it fair to say that free speech is dead?
You know, the reason why I went to grad school at Berkeley is because it's the cradle of free speech. I knew about that since the time I was a kid. I would say in my 2 years there, and I just graduated this past May with my second master's, free speech is dead in Berkeley. I don't think it's dead in the rest of the country. I do think it's being flogged pretty mercilessly. I think it's under threat, but I think that's part of the nature of a free society. You know, I would say it's been the #1 driver of my audience growth on LinkedIn. So I would take my 300,000 subscribers as some evidence that there's strong interest in free speech.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely fair. You know, we've talked a little bit about the word liberal and conservative. And my understanding is that, you know, the typical definition of liberal just simply means left leaning. How else can that be defined?
Well, so liberal has a long history. So kind of going back to European politics and thought, what's termed as like a classical liberal, a continental liberal. For centuries, a liberal was known as someone who's liberal was open-minded. Mm-hmm. And the idea of like if somebody calls himself a classical liberal, that's what they're referring to. The idea is there are left progressive points of view that I find valuable. There are conservative points of view that I'm open-minded. I want to hear from the broadest range of perspectives possible. And that's kind of what a university is supposed to be based on. Mm-hmm. You know, in America, and especially in the last century or so, liberal has become associated with progressive, kind of like you said, left-wing. And, you know, in my mind, you know, PC police, lefty good, righty bad, that's kind of a viewpoint that's grown to dominate the news media, Washington, D.C., and Hollywood. And this is coming from somebody who, as you know, is not exactly a conservative.
Right, voted for Obama twice.
Yeah, and worked on his campaign. And that was the thing. Going to Berkeley, I knew that going in. But, you know, I was at the journalism school, and I was the most conservative person there out of about 120 people. And that's what I'm talking about, intolerance. That's insane.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting to me because we simultaneously have to juggle two things. The first is that there are some very hateful people out there, and I think most sane individuals would agree that that particular line of rhetoric, when it leads to violence, is completely unacceptable. Not acceptable. And yet, on the flip side of that coin, there is what you refer to as the heckler's veto. And tell me if I understand this correctly. This is when someone comes in and speaks, and then just they get shouted down. And this is something that happened with some frequency at UC Berkeley. That's correct?
Right. And so one of the things I did along with other students is we invited a number of controversial speakers: Milo Yiannopoulos, Ann Coulter, David Horowitz. The idea is if you disagree with somebody, all the more reason to hear them out. That's who you can learn from the most. Now, in terms of the heckler's veto, when these riots occurred and the speakers got canceled, the students from the Bolt Law School at Berkeley, we held a roundtable actually with faculty, law faculty. And this is, again, is not exactly a right-leaning group of people. This was mostly taken from the Berkeley Law School. And the consensus among them is there is no legal standard of hate speech. There's no legal statute for hate speech in the U.S. There are in other countries, but basically hate speech is subjective. And in practice, hate speech becomes any speech that somebody hates. And that's why the Founding Fathers they wanted the First Amendment, they wanted free speech to be as free as possible. The idea is you respond to speech you don't like with other speech. And so with the heckler's veto, what happened at Berkeley is people some of these people were communists, socialists, anarchists. They would organize and say that Milo Yiannopoulos or Ann Coulter or Donald Trump or Scott Pruitt or at one point a few years ago Bill Maher were engaging in hate speech and was offensive and was a threat to them, and they would use protests and sometimes overt violence, which people saw around the world: Molotov cocktails, rocks, bottles, fireworks in bottles, cracking people in the head with bike locks to try to shut down the free speech. And that is the heckler's veto. So what happened was at Berkeley and other places is the administration, the city government canceled these speakers because of the risk of violence. So they cited public safety. Mm-hmm. That's a slippery slope, though. When you value public safety over the First Amendment, then that means that anybody that can threaten violence has a chance to shut down free speech, and that is the heckler's veto.
And I'm glad, because you mentioned a number of people on the right, and then you mentioned Bill Maher. And so there's a quote here that I'll take directly from an article you wrote on LinkedIn that includes Michael Bloomberg and Charles Koch agree on something. It's newsworthy. And when the two billionaire businessmen philanthropists on different ends of the political spectrum write an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that called out my beloved University of California, Berkeley, on the commencement weekend, reading it infuriated me because they are absolutely right. Quote, "The two of us, who don't see eye to eye on every issue, believe that the most urgent advice we can offer is actually to college presidents, boards, administrators, and faculty. Stop stifling free speech and coddling intolerance." And so it appears as though, and Taleb talks about this a lot as we maybe migrate into that conversation about his incredible work. But it's not a left or right thing. We're talking about, and I love the way you put this in our previous conversations, sunshine is the best disinfectant. Who is that from?
It's from Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis from about 100 years ago. And I agree too. The thing is I think the left-right thing is a lot of, I think it's contrived. And that's the thing too, is maybe Ann Coulter, who was one of the speakers who didn't get to speak at Berkeley that I wrote about, I think you could definitely describe her as a conservative. But somebody like Milo Yiannopoulos, I think one of the reasons why he was considered so dangerous is because he does not fit into that paradigm. I think two other reasons why he was dangerous was because he was very good at using the news media, and he's also very funny. And so he was a very difficult person to kind of pigeonhole and make a straw man or a piñata out of. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I find that fascinating. This is actually a really great segue into the next segment, which is to chat about Nassim Nicholas Taleb's Antifragile. Now, this is not a book for the faint of heart. Taleb has been described in, let's call it, colorful language over the years. And I am on round 2 of this particular book because it really is that good. And it took me a minute to kind of let it wash over me and get used to his particular style. So why don't we start out, Jim, with a definition of what is Antifragile?
Definitely. And one thing about Taleb that I find him interesting, he's a trader, he's a philosopher, and he's sold millions of copies of books. So it's interesting. He's got something interesting going on. And so this word, so anti-fragile, it's like, you start reading, I'm like, what does that mean? And he asks, he's like, what's the opposite of fragile? And a lot of people, my first response was like sturdy. And he's like, no, that's not right. So something's fragile. If I throw this bottle, if this was glass, I throw it against the wall and it would shatter. That's fragile. Now this is plastic. If I throw it against the wall, most likely it's not gonna break. It might. If it cracked, it would be fragile. But if it's intact, then that's sturdy. But he said anti-fragile was if you threw this bottle against the wall and it bounced back stronger. Mm-hmm. And so at first you're like, that seems like maybe an absurd notion. He's like, no, not at all. You look at natural systems. Your muscles are anti-fragile. Resistance training, stress strengthens them. A lot of ecological systems are like that. Forests in the American West, they need big wildfires to reproduce and make the soil more fertile. Mm-hmm. They're anti-fragile. They benefit from disorder and from change.
That's absolutely right, and I love that you mentioned that, because in the book, that was one of my favorite pieces of the puzzle. And Taleb has a bit of a love affair with entrepreneurs because he believes that small, consistent mistakes are so much better than this illusion that if we just have stability, everything's going to be fine.
Exactly.
So two examples on that. The first is the forest fire that occurs after us preventing it intentionally for 100 years. It's just going to be so much more devastating than periodic small fires. The second is what he refers to as the turkey phenomenon. Take an analyst, for example, who is looking at the trend of a turkey, and it's great. It's getting fed. Things are good. It's gaining weight. Healthy turkey, fantastic. And then here comes the black swan event. Here comes the butcher to kill the turkey. And we experience similar things in the markets because the analysts and the stockholders and everyone wants stability, and yet that is the exact system that is creating this devastating end result.
Definitely. And the idea of the entrepreneur, small mistakes to avoid a bigger one later, because basically entrepreneurs are constantly seeking out imbalances, flaws, opportunities in the system. So it's small mistakes versus too big to fail. And the turkey metaphor is applied to what happened in the financial markets right up until, the turkey was getting real fat right in 2007. And times a lot of people thought things were great right up until they weren't.
Mm-hmm. That is 100% accurate. To get a little personal, because this meant a lot to me. So my son, Phoenix, was recently diagnosed with level 1 autism. And so I've been doing a ton of research into that. And I found it somewhat serendipitous that Taleb uses two mythological creatures in his book to describe anti-fragility. The first is the Hydra. For those of you that are not familiar, it's got, call it 6 heads. You cut one head off, the head grows back. The second is the Phoenix. Right. And there was a good reason why I named my son Phoenix, is because, I do and always have believed in anti-fragility as like a mantra, essentially. Like the greatest companies are anti-fragile, the best relationships are anti-fragile.
And that's a great point, because he says it's an intuitive thing. People that have experience skin in the game. He says there's the professional class, the bureaucratic class, the academic class who've kind of lost touch with the notion. But yeah, please continue.
No, but that's absolutely right. And so I'm reminded, and this is a good time for a word you may not have heard. I had to look up a couple words, I'm not embarrassed to admit. Taleb he's a good writer, and one of them happens to be the word iatrogenic. And this refers to the Hippocratic oath, wherein doctors say that first do no harm. Something that is iatrogenic is harm caused unintentionally, specifically to medical treatment, but he makes the connection to all sorts of systems, wherein the attempt to, here's a good example that he puts into the book, the banker who's got this consistent paycheck, things are great, family's great, compare him to his brother who's the taxi driver, and what's the seemingly unstable income of an entrepreneur, someone like who drives a taxi, allows that taxi driver to continuously adapt to the market, and in fact become an Uber driver as this changes. And yet the 401k, the cushy leather seat, in the corner office can result in a black swan event, which is you're fired, you're done.
Right. I mean, and he's made this point in this book, and then his later book, Skin in the Game, which came out recently, is that he talks about a salaried employee is a legalized form of slavery. Oh. And he does talk about like a person with a good salary, especially somebody who's overpaid, who has a family, that is a true slave, because a lot of times these people know they're overpaid, and so you can make them do whatever you want. And so you think about certain people in the news media, certain people in academia, certain people in big corporations. That's kind of the classic. He calls them IYIs, intellectuals yet idiots.
They are indentured servants. So it's interesting to me because I simultaneously, I understand what you're saying. I have the best employees on planet Earth, right? And we are a team, and we are just kicking so much butt. And so as a business owner, sometimes it's hard to pay employees in a way that is anti-fragile. And I've actually done it. I set up a former employee of mine on a plan that was based on bonus structure, and I'm doing that again. It's called profit sharing. So that's something that folks can do to kind of help them
incentivize.
Skin in the game. That's exactly the word. Put some skin in the game. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I would say. This book is a long read. I think it's entertaining in parts. It's dry in others. I think it probably could have been 100 pages shorter, but I think there's some real value to business people in reading it, listening to it, this is a start, getting a summary of it. You can think about how these apply to your business strategy, your supply chain, computer systems, the internet, the electric grid, your investments, your cash flow, all these things. Is if you can make them anti-fragile, then you're in a position where you can benefit from disorder, benefit from change. Because one thing, he makes the point that predictions are very fragile. We don't know what's going to happen. The only thing we do know for sure is that change is going to happen. We're pretty confident in that. We're pretty confident that we don't know what is going to happen in most cases, other than death and taxes. And so the idea is this kind of gives you some actionable insights as to how to arrange your life to benefit from that disorder and change.
Yeah, and one of the things he mentions, and I think about while I'm listening to you, is that there is a period of rest required after, for example, working out. Taleb is a big fan of the max lift style of exercise, which absolutely requires resting. Yeah. And entrepreneurs, that's in part kind of why we're doing this show is Listen Over Lunch. The name of it is intentional because you're working, you're grinding out, you're doing your morning, and then this is a good way for you to relax, take in some new information, and then get ready to fight in the afternoon.
Right.
And so anti-fragility as an overall concept in business, I've applied in a number of ways after reading this book.
One thing big takeaway for me, and this is again coming from Berkeley and from journalism school, is he writes quite a bit about the news media, and this to me is maybe the clearest application to a business person. Just about every business person I know has at least two urgent priorities. One, they need access to accurate information, concise, accurate information, ideally, wouldn't you say? And related to that is one commodity they're not making any more of besides land is time. So business people need access to concise, accurate information, and they need to not waste time. And so that leads me to the news media. Like, I had a fairly dim view of the news media before I got to Berkeley. And after spending time there, I wrote for the Los Angeles Times and a bunch of others for years. I knew a lot of great people in journalism. Those people all got canned and they got replaced. I think basically everybody who's still working in the profession is a clown. You kind of have to be to have the job. And so the point is, if you need fair and accurate information and you're short on time, I think the news media is about the last place you want to go. And so I want to read a little bit. This is a passage from Taleb. He talked about signal versus noise. Signal being valuable data, valuable information, noise being background noise, the stuff that's not valuable, that takes up your time and energy. The more frequently you look at data, the more noise you are disproportionately likely to get, rather than the valuable part called a signal. Hence, the higher the noise to signal ratio. Okay. If you look at the very same data on a daily basis, the composition of noise to signal would change to 95% noise, 5% signal. Now, originally he prefers to read books, and preferably books that are old, because what he's saying, you might miss out on some new information, but the idea is if you're reading books that are 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years old, and that they've stood the test of time, they're basically going to be 100% signal, 0% noise. So when you switch to news and you watch the daily news, he said it switches from 100% signal, basically, with a classic book, to 5% signal, 95% noise. Now, we're living in a 24/7 news cycle now. So if you observe data on an hourly basis, as people immersed in the news and market price variations do, the split becomes 99.5% noise to 0.5% signal. 99.5% of what you're hearing is useless, is what he's saying. He's arguing that is 200 times more noise than signal, which is why anyone who listens to news, except when very, very significant events take place, is one step below sucker. So one of the things I advocate, and this again probably explains why I was not super popular in the journalism world, is I think if people want to be better informed, I think they're better off turning off the news, reading books, and finding new perspectives. And that's one thing I like about LinkedIn is you can actually read individual people.
Yeah, no, interesting. One of the things you told me about LinkedIn that I thought was absolutely fascinating is that they don't indemnify their writers, whereas a journalistic entity may, have a team of lawyers that will crop up to help protect their writers.
And that's true of all platforms. Individual, whether Medium or somebody publishing on, basically because they're hosting me, so it's the Internet Communications Decency Act. USC 230, and so the idea is that's what enabled this flowering of free speech on the internet, is that you're not Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Medium, they're not liable. Like if I write something that somebody finds libelous, you don't have a case against LinkedIn, you have the case against me. They're just a hosting platform. It's the same thing Yelp. It's been litigated as well.
Yeah, well, I think it's fantastic because and this show is a good example of that. There are no dollars in our pocket that are coming from an interest group. So you're getting closer and closer to free speech. While you were chatting, I wrote down being led by news, and I think that if we are on a 24-hour news cycle and you get addicted to that, you do end up in this particular, what's been referred to as the bubble.
Yeah, the echo chamber.
Yeah, in my world, absolutely. I mean, it's this ongoing indoctrination into this specific camp, and the camps have colors, and the camps have language, and it's very tribal. And people get really frustrated with me when I talk about being independent because they roll their eyes and they go, "Oh, really?" And it is increasingly difficult to be balanced and to discern facts when the echo chamber is almost unavoidable.
Yeah, and there's a thing at Berkeley is, again, because I'm not really a conservative, although I try to be a classical liberal. I think there's a lot of valuable things I learned from conservative people and just from liberal left-wing people, But the thing was, I'm at Berkeley, I was at Berkeley to learn new things, and when I'm reading, I'm there to read new things. I don't agree with everything Taleb says. I mean, one of the things is he rips on Steven Pinker constantly. I like Steven Pinker. Steven Pinker is one of my favorites. I actually interviewed him for my master's thesis. But what I'm saying is that's actually really interesting. If they were just agreeing with each other constantly, I wouldn't learn as much. That sharp disagreement crystallizes the differences in the knowledge, and it's valuable. And that was the thing at Berkeley. I was upset. I wouldn't even say so much that they were hostile to conservatives. They were hostile to anyone, this is at the journalism school, that didn't follow the PC police left-wing dogma. And not to say that everybody in Berkeley at the university or the school is like that, not at all, but the people who are more open-minded, I know a lot of them, they get shouted down. Some of them got their skulls cracked, and that's insane.
Yeah, I think it's a fairly easy statement to make that whenever violence is the outcome of speech, then we have a problem. So there are a couple of things you said. One of them that I just continue to go back to and really like is the definition of a classic liberal, which is someone who is open-minded. That is so important to me, and I love having conversations with folks all over the spectrum. Left, right, and then also on the spectrum of business. I chat with a lot of folks that are startups all the way through to the largest corporations, and they struggle with finding their particular brand of anti-fragility, and having a corporation that struggles to find their own version of free speech is something that a lot of companies, I know at least, are having issues with. And I will mention this, and this is really, really neat. There is a movement going on right now that's referred to as cause marketing, and I feel like it gets into some of the more free speech that corporations can get out there. A good example was Dove's campaign for Real Beauty, where they had a sketch artist come in and have a woman describe what she looks like to the sketch artist, and then they had another person come in and they had a chit chat, and they had the stranger describe what the woman looks like, and the woman's perspective of herself was not nearly as flattering as the stranger's. And that sort of speech within a corporate environment, for those of you that are thinking about neat and interesting ways to speak as a corporation, that right there I think is the next evolution for businesses. And so this right here is also an iteration as well. So Jim's book, Clean Tech Con Artist, coming out later this year. This is the way that we need to promote these kinds of things, is we need to have high-level, interesting debates, provide as much value as possible, be as free as possible. That's one of the things I really admire about you, actually. Nice. is that you have managed to be independent, isn't the right word. It's just you are not beholden.
I've never had a salaried job in my life.
You're just not beholden to folks. And so I
also haven't owned a television since I was a kid either, and I think those two things are related to each other. I really like to read. I prefer to read books.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. And so, this right here, this show, Listen Over Lunch, is, in my opinion, a really strong effort at free speech. I think this is a good example of what it looks like.
Yeah, I mean, there's a flowering of communications around the world that we haven't seen since the dawn of the telegraph in the 19th century. Before the telegraph, communications traveled only as fast as a horse or a sail or a steamship. Then all of a sudden you could communicate instantaneously around the world with cable. Of course, there was very limited bandwidth. Now we're at a point where just about anybody with an internet connection, you can go on LinkedIn or Medium or YouTube. You can publish whatever format you like. You can publish in professional quality, distribute essentially infinite copies around the world instantaneously for no money. That's a revolution in human affairs. It's highly asymmetrical. It's highly destabilizing of the establishment. There's a lot of interesting things going on around the world, from like Donald Trump to Brexit to different things. And whether you think those things are the solution or the symptom of a problem, I think reasonable people can disagree, but it is clear that this is a fundamental change in human affairs. And I think it's to the positive, but like anything, there's a lot of challenges and danger in it. But overall, I'm optimistic. Me too. And as our time is concluding, any other thoughts on free speech before we transition? I would just say free speech is not just the right to speak, it is the right to be heard. And what Frederick Douglass said is that when you deprive somebody of free speech, it's a double wrong. It deprives the speaker as well as the hearer. And quite often the hearer who disagrees is the one who suffers the most harm. Interesting. Well said. Last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, artificial intelligence, as it applies to your business. This video, the words that I am saying right now, you can imagine streaming right here. Every single one of them. For example, if I said Jim Rossi is by far the best writer on LinkedIn, those words are being understood by Google's artificial intelligence RankBrain, which rolled out in 2015. And so what you need to understand is that video content like this is written content. Because when we take this video, which we will, and upload it to YouTube, every single word we've said over the last 29 minutes will appear as an auto-created caption on the video itself, which, if embedded into a blog post, makes that blog post a 10,000-word blog. And for those of you that understand SEO, you get how powerful that is. So we now live in a world where Facebook's, Instagram's, Twitter's, and Google's AI technology determines our revenue. So, is this a little nerve-wracking? No question. If you get in front of the camera, you're going to be a little bit nervous. Absolutely. It's a totally normal thing. But it is becoming more and more essential, necessary. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Listen Over Lunch with Jim and Kellen, a show for bright professionals. Jim, I had a blast. How about you? Likewise. Can't wait to do it again.